Dr. Preston Ainsley said it loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. Some of us actually went to medical school. Others just learned to look busy in scrubs. He was talking about Grace Ellison, and the laughter that followed his comment would still be echoing through the hospital's break room 3 weeks later, when 30 uniformed veterans rose to their feet the moment she walked into a room, and Preston Ainsley finally understood exactly who he had spent 8 months mocking. Grace Ellison was 30 years old, 5'6", with long, honey-blonde hair she wore in a simple, low ponytail during shifts, framing a face that people often described, in passing, as strikingly pretty, the kind of quiet, understated beauty that drew attention despite her clear efforts not to seek it. Her eyes were a soft hazel that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, and she carried herself with a careful, unassuming stillness that made her easy to overlook in a room full of louder personalities, which was, as it happened, precisely the effect she had spent 2 years cultivating. She had worked at Ridgefield County Hospital for 8 months, arriving with an employment file that listed her prior experience only as clinical trauma support, non-civilian sector, vague enough that the hiring committee had assumed, without asking further questions, that she'd worked in some kind of unconventional private practice setting. Nobody had pushed for specifics, and Grace had never volunteered more. Because the specifics belonged to a chapter of her life, she preferred to carry quietly rather than explain to people who wouldn't fully understand it anyway. What her file did not say, what almost nobody at Ridgefield knew, was that Grace Ellison had spent 6 years as an Army officer, the final 3 as a combat nurse attached to a forward surgical team, deployed twice to conflict zones where she had treated wounded soldiers under conditions that made even Ridgefield's busiest trauma nights look, by comparison, remarkably calm. She had held the rank of captain at the time of her separation from active duty, earned through years of exceptional field performance and a specific, quiet resilience that had made her, among the soldiers she'd treated, one of the most trusted and beloved medical officers many of them had ever encountered. She had left the Army 2 years earlier, worn down not by any single catastrophic failure, but by the accumulated weight of watching young men and women arrive on her table again and again, some of them not leaving it, until she had needed, more than anything, a version of medicine where she could simply help people without the specific, crushing finality that combat medicine so often carried. Her civilian life, in the 2 years before the health fair, had settled into a specific, deliberate rhythm she had built with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She lived alone in a small, tidy apartment a short drive from the hospital, ran most mornings along a quiet residential route before her shifts, a habit carried forward from her military training that continued to offer her the same steadying, meditative quality it always had. She kept her personal life deliberately small and unremarkable, cultivating a handful of genuine but carefully bounded friendships among the Ridgefield staff, close enough for ordinary warmth but never close enough to require the kind of full disclosure that might have unraveled the careful vagueness she maintained about her history. She had told herself, over those 2 years, that this careful smallness was simply a reasonable accommodation to her own privacy preferences, a natural byproduct of someone who had never particularly enjoyed being the center of attention, even before her military service had given her considerably more reason to avoid it. She had not fully examined, until the health fair forced the issue, how much of that smallness was actually about protecting herself from having to relive the specific weight of her service history in the retelling, rather than any genuine indifference to being known more fully by the people around her. She had found that quieter life at Ridgefield. She had not expected Dr. Preston Ainsley, the hospital's most senior orthopedic surgeon, to spend 8 months treating her like an afterthought. Nor had she expected that afternoon's public mockery in the cafeteria to be the beginning of the end of his ability to do so. Dr. Preston Ainsley was 47 years old, Ridgefield County Hospital's most senior orthopedic surgeon, a man whose reputation had been built over 2 decades on genuine surgical skill and an equally genuine, cultivated sense of his own importance within the hospital's social hierarchy. He had trained at a prestigious program, had a corner office with his name etched into the glass door, and had developed, over the years, a particular habit of using humor, sharp, public, and rarely kind, to establish and maintain his position at the top of whatever room he occupied. Part of that habit traced back to his own early career, a specific insecurity he rarely examined, but that had shaped nearly everything about his professional persona since. He had trained under an attending surgeon whose approval had felt, throughout his residency, perpetually just out of reach, and had developed, in response, a compensatory pattern of establishing his own authority through humor at other people's expense, a way of ensuring, in every room he subsequently occupied, that he would be the one setting the terms of the conversation rather than the one anxiously seeking someone else's validation. He had never fully connected this pattern to its origin, having long since convinced himself that his sharp wit was simply an authentic personality trait rather than a specific, defensive habit built to protect an old, unexamined wound. He had settled on Grace as an easy target within her first month at Ridgefield, mostly because she rarely defended herself against his comments, absorbing them with a quiet, unbothered composure that some of the staff found admirable, and that Ainsley, in his private and rarely examined reasoning, seemed to interpret as confirmation that his jabs landed exactly where he intended them to. He mocked her quietness, mocked her tendency to stay out of hospital gossip, occasionally implied, in front of colleagues, that she'd likely taken the nursing path because it required less rigor than the one he'd chosen for himself. Grace never responded in kind. She had learned, a long time ago, in circumstances considerably more consequential than a hospital cafeteria, that engaging with someone determined to diminish you rarely changed their mind, and that her energy was better spent on the actual work in front of her. That particular afternoon, the mockery had started over something trivial. Grace declining to join a betting pool on a football game during her lunch break, offering only a polite, brief explanation that she wasn't interested. Ainsley, holding court at a nearby table with several residents and fellow physicians, had seized on the moment with the specific relish of a man who enjoyed an easy audience. "Come on, Ellison, live a little," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Or is that not in the nursing curriculum?" "I forget. What exactly do they teach you people besides how to fetch charts and look sympathetic?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the cafeteria, some of it genuine amusement from Ainsley's regular audience, some of it the specific, awkward laughter of people who didn't find the comment particularly funny but weren't willing to risk becoming his next target by staying silent. Grace looked at him for a moment, her expression giving away nothing beyond a mild, unbothered calm. "I'm just not interested in the pool, doctor," she said. "That's all it is." "Some of us actually went to medical school," Ainsley continued, undeterred, warming to the material now that he had an audience. "Others just learned to look busy in scrubs. I'm not trying to be cruel, Ellison. I'm just being honest. There's a considerable difference between what I do and what you do, and I think it's worth some of the newer staff understanding that distinction clearly." The laughter that followed was louder this time, emboldened by his confidence, and Grace simply gathered her tray, offered a small, polite nod to no one in particular, and left the cafeteria without a word, the same quiet, unbothered exit she'd made from a dozen similar moments over the preceding 8 months. She had no idea, walking down the hallway back toward her unit, that in exactly 3 weeks, 30 uniformed veterans would fill that same cafeteria, rise to their feet the instant she walked through the door, and force Preston Ainsley to finally, permanently understand exactly whose intelligence and dedication he had spent 8 months mocking in front of an audience that had, until that moment, never once questioned whether his jokes were actually funny. What none of the staff at Ridgefield knew about Grace Ellison, and what would take a considerably more dramatic event than a cafeteria comment to reveal, was the full weight of the 6 years she had spent building a reputation within the Army that had followed her, quietly and persistently, into a civilian life she had specifically chosen to keep separate from it. She had entered the Army at 22, immediately after completing her nursing degree, driven by a combination of restlessness and a genuine, deeply held desire to serve in a way that felt more demanding and more consequential than the civilian nursing track she'd been quietly drifting toward. She had excelled quickly, distinguishing herself during her initial training with the same quiet, unflashy competence that would come to define her entire career, and had been selected, at 25, for the considerably more demanding role of combat nurse attached to a forward surgical team, a role that placed her, repeatedly, within close range of the war's worst consequences. Over 3 years and 2 deployments, Grace had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, working in field hospitals and forward operating bases under conditions that tested every element of her training and composure. She had held soldiers' hands through amputations performed by lamplight, had kept dying men talking about their families in the final minutes of their lives because she believed, fiercely, that no one should die feeling alone, had stayed awake for stretches exceeding 30 hours because the flow of wounded simply didn't stop long enough for rest to feel like an option. She had become, within the specific, close-knit world of the units she served, something considerably more significant than a competent nurse. She had become, to the soldiers who passed through her care, a person whose calm presence in the worst moments of their lives had made an unbearable experience marginally more bearable, a quiet, steady constant that dozens, eventually hundreds, of wounded soldiers carried with them long after they left her care, whether they recovered fully or carried permanent scars from what had happened to them. She had left the Army at 28, worn down not by any single catastrophic failure, but by the accumulated grief of watching too many young people arrive broken and leave the same way, or not leave at all. She had needed, more than anything, a version of medicine that didn't carry quite the same weight, a place where healing felt more achievable and loss felt less inevitable. She had found that at Ridgefield. She had built, over 8 months, a quiet, careful civilian life, telling almost no one the full truth of where her extraordinary competence had actually come from, choosing instead to simply do her work well and let her file's vague description of clinical trauma support stand in for the 6 years she preferred not to explain in detail to people who hadn't been there. She had not expected the two worlds to ever collide. She had certainly not expected them to collide because of a single email sent by a Veterans Outreach Coordinator to Ridgefield's administration, informing the hospital that a regional support group for wounded veterans, men and women who had served across multiple conflicts, many of them still managing injuries and trauma from their service, would be visiting the hospital in 3 weeks for a community health fair, and that several of the group's members had specifically requested, by name, to see whether a nurse named Grace Ellison still worked there. The email reached Dr. Patricia Kwan, Ridgefield's hospital administrator, on a Tuesday afternoon, and it took her considerable effort to piece together, over the following hour of careful phone calls to the Veterans Outreach Coordinator, exactly why a nurse on her staff, an unassuming, quiet woman she mostly knew by reputation as competent and pleasant, nothing more remarkable than that, would be specifically named by more than a dozen former soldiers as someone they wanted to see. Dr. Kwan had run Ridgefield County Hospital's administration for nearly a decade, having built her own reputation on a specific, genuine commitment to staff well-being that had made her, among the hospital's employees, one of the more trusted figures in its leadership. She took the Veterans Outreach Coordinator's call seriously precisely because it didn't fit the ordinary pattern of administrative business, and her instinct, honed over years of managing a large and complex staff, told her almost immediately that this particular development, deserved considerably more attention than a routine scheduling matter. They asked for her specifically, the coordinator explained. Several of our members served with her or were treated by her during deployments overseas. When they heard Ridgefield would be hosting the health fair and that she worked there, they made it a priority. Some of them have been planning this for weeks. I had no idea, Dr. Kwan admitted. Her file doesn't mention combat service specifically. It's fairly vague, honestly. That doesn't surprise me, the coordinator said. A lot of veterans, especially medical personnel, prefer to keep that chapter separate from their civilian work. But I want you to understand something clearly, Dr. Kwan, because I don't think it's coming through in this conversation yet. The people asking about her aren't just grateful former patients. Several of them describe her as the reason they're alive at all. That's not an exaggeration on their part. I've heard some of these stories directly. Dr. Kwan sat with that information for a long moment after the call ended, turning over everything she thought she knew about Grace Ellison, and finding it, suddenly, considerably less complete than she'd assumed. She thought, with a specific, uncomfortable clarity, about several offhand comments she'd overheard from Dr. Ainsley over the preceding months. Comments dismissed at the time as harmless ribbing. Comments she now understood, in this new light, to carry a considerably crueler weight than she'd previously registered. She called Grace into her office the following morning and watched, with genuine curiosity, as Grace's careful composure flickered, just slightly, at the mention of the veteran's visit. "They asked for me specifically?" Grace said, her voice carrying a note of surprise that seemed, to Dr. Kwan, entirely genuine rather than performed. "By name," Dr. Kwan confirmed. "The coordinator said several of them describe you as the reason they're alive. I have to admit, Grace, I didn't fully understand the scope of your service history until this call. Your file is fairly minimal on the specifics." Grace was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to share, the way she weighed most things. "I served 6 years," she said finally. "The last 3 as a combat nurse with a forward surgical team. I treated a lot of wounded soldiers, over 2 deployments. I didn't think any of them would remember me specifically, not years later. I was just doing my job." "From what I gathered on that call," Dr. Kwan said gently, "your job apparently meant considerably more to the people you did it for than you might be giving yourself credit for." Grace absorbed this with a specific, quiet stillness, something in her expression suggesting she was processing not just the news itself, but the strange, disorienting sensation of her carefully separated worlds beginning, without her consent, to merge. "When are they arriving?" she asked. 3 weeks, Dr. Kwan said. "The health fair's scheduled for the 14th. I wanted you to have time to prepare, emotionally if nothing else. This sounds like it's going to be a significant day." Grace nodded slowly, already turning over the specific, complicated mixture of anticipation and apprehension that came with the prospect of seeing, after years of distance, the faces of people whose worst days she had shared with them. That evening, alone in her apartment, Grace allowed herself to think properly, for the first time in longer than she usually permitted, about the specific soldiers whose faces would likely be among the 30 veterans arriving in 3 weeks. She thought about Corporal James Whitlow, 22 years old when she'd first treated him, who had arrived at her forward surgical unit with catastrophic injuries to both legs after an IED explosion, and whom she had personally stayed with through 3 separate surgeries over 11 hours, holding his hand and talking him through his fear in the specific, steady voice she had learned to use for exactly these moments. Whitlow had survived, had eventually walked again on prosthetics after months of grueling rehabilitation, and had written her a letter, years later, that she still kept in a small box of memories she rarely opened, but had never once considered discarding. She thought about Staff Sergeant Denise Okafor, who had come through her unit with a severe abdominal wound and a fear, expressed to Grace in a quiet, private moment during recovery, that she would never be able to have children after the specific nature of her injuries. Grace had sat with her for nearly 2 hours that night, past the end of her own shift, simply talking, offering what comfort and honest medical information she could, refusing to leave Okafor alone with that fear in the dark. Okafor had gone on, Grace later learned through informal channels, to have 2 children after all, defying the specific worry that had consumed her during recovery. She thought about Private First Class Marcus Delgado, 18 years old, the youngest soldier she had ever treated, who had lost his closest friend in the same explosion that had wounded him, and who had cried in Grace's arms for nearly 20 minutes the night after the incident, not from his own physical pain, which was considerable, but from a grief too large for his young age to fully process alone. She had held him, had let him cry without rushing him toward composure, had simply been present in a way that she suspected, even now, had mattered more to his eventual recovery than any of the actual medical care she'd provided. There were dozens more, faces and names that came back to her with varying degrees of clarity, each one a small, specific thread connecting her current quiet civilian life to a version of herself she rarely discussed, but had never once regretted becoming. She had not fully understood, until Dr. Kwan's news that afternoon, how much those threads had continued to matter on the other end, how many of the soldiers she'd treated had carried her presence forward into their own recoveries, their own lives, in ways she'd had no way of knowing about from the careful distance she'd maintained since leaving active duty. She found herself, that evening, pulling out the small box of letters and mementos she'd kept from her service years, reading through several of them for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, allowing herself, in the privacy of her own apartment, to feel the specific, complicated weight of a chapter of her life she had spent 2 years trying to hold at a careful, manageable distance. She did not yet know exactly which of these soldiers, if any, would be among the 30 veterans arriving in 3 weeks. She understood only that the health fair was going to be considerably more significant than an ordinary Tuesday at Ridgefield County Hospital, and that Preston Ainsley's careful, comfortable assumptions about her were about to be tested in a way neither of them yet fully anticipated. The 3 weeks leading up to the health fair passed for Grace with a specific, quiet tension that colored nearly every ordinary shift, a rising anticipation she carefully kept hidden beneath her usual composed exterior, aware that word of the veteran's visit had begun to circulate through the hospital's staff, though most people, including Dr. Kwan, had chosen to keep the specific reason for their interest in Grace relatively private, understanding correctly that it was Grace's story to share, or not share, on her own terms. Ainsley, unaware of the approaching reckoning, continued his ordinary pattern of casual dismissiveness toward her throughout those 3 weeks, seemingly encouraged rather than discouraged by his cafeteria audience's laughter, escalating, if anything, into slightly sharper territory as the days passed. "Ellison's going to be famous," he announced one afternoon to a cluster of colleagues in the staff lounge, having somehow learned that a veterans group was visiting specifically in connection with her. "Apparently some old soldiers are coming to see her. Must be nice having fans who don't know any better. I heard some of them served with her," a resident named Dr. Farrow offered, uncertain whether the observation would be received as genuine information or as an invitation for further mockery. "Served with her doing what, exactly?" Ainsley said with a dismissive laugh. "Filling out paperwork? I'm sure it's a very moving story. Whatever it is, I just find it hard to imagine our quiet little Ellison as anyone's hero." Grace, passing through the lounge at that exact moment on her way to check on a patient, heard the comment clearly, and something in her expression, for the first time in 8 months, shifted. Not into visible anger, which she had never once allowed him to see, but into a specific, weary resolve that suggested she had, finally, stopped extending him quite as much patience as she once had. "I'll be sure to introduce you to them, Doctor," she said, her voice carrying a flat, quiet steadiness that made several people in the room go momentarily still. "I think you'll find the conversation instructive." She continued down the hallway without waiting for a response, and Ainsley, momentarily thrown by the specific, unfamiliar edge in her voice, covered his surprise with a short, uncertain laugh before returning to his conversation with considerably less confidence than he'd started it with. The morning of the health fair arrived with the particular, charged energy of an event the entire hospital had spent weeks anticipating, though for reasons that varied considerably depending on who you asked. Hospital administration had organized the event as a broader community health outreach initiative, with screening stations, informational booths, and a modest reception planned for the visiting veterans group alongside the general public attendees. Grace arrived early, dressed in her usual scrubs but carrying a specific, quiet nervousness she rarely allowed herself to show, uncertain exactly what the day would bring or how she would manage the emotional weight of potentially seeing soldiers she had once treated in circumstances neither of them would likely ever fully discuss with the people around them now. Dr. Kwan found her in the hallway outside the main event space around 9:30 that morning, offering a brief, supportive smile. "The veterans bus just arrived," she said. "They're being welcomed in the main lobby before moving through to the cafeteria for the reception. I wanted you to have some warning before things get underway." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice carrying a specific tightness she made no particular effort to hide from Dr. Kwan, who had, over the preceding 3 weeks, become something closer to a genuine confidant than an ordinary administrative supervisor. "Are you doing all right?" Dr. Kwan asked. "I don't fully know yet," Grace admitted. "I think I will be. I'm just not sure what the next hour is actually going to feel like." She had no way of knowing, standing in that quiet hospital hallway with her heart beating considerably faster than her outward composure suggested, that the next hour was about to become the single most significant reckoning of Preston Ainsley's entire professional career. The cafeteria had been transformed for the occasion. Tables cleared to the sides to make room for a modest reception area with refreshments and a welcoming banner. And by 10 o'clock that morning, it was filled with a mixture of hospital staff, community members attending the broader health fair, and 30 veterans, ranging in age from their late 20s to their 70s, some in wheelchairs, some with visible prosthetics, several wearing jackets or caps identifying their branch of service, all of them carrying the specific, unmistakable bearing of people who had served and survived something significant. The organizers had arranged the veterans loosely near the front of the room, close to the entrance, a seating decision that had seemed, at the time of planning, like simple, practical logistics rather than anything more deliberate. In retrospect, several hospital staff would later remark on how perfectly positioned the group happened to be for what followed, close enough to the door that every one of them had a clear, immediate line of sight the moment Grace stepped through it. Preston Ainsley was among the hospital staff present, having been specifically asked by Dr. Kwan to attend as one of the senior physicians representing the hospital's leadership, an invitation he had accepted with his usual easy confidence, expecting, as he later admitted, a fairly unremarkable morning of handshakes and polite small talk. Grace entered the cafeteria at 10:15, having finished checking on her assigned patients, still visibly nervous despite her efforts to appear composed, and stepped through the doorway into a room she had expected to find engaged in ordinary reception chatter. The room did not stay in ordinary reception chatter for more than a single second after she appeared in the doorway. The first veteran to notice her was a man in his 60s near the front of the gathered crowd, and the recognition that crossed his face was immediate and unmistakable, his expression shifting from polite social attentiveness into something considerably more profound, and before anyone around him fully understood what was happening, he had risen from his seat, drawn himself into a formal, deliberate posture, and rendered a slow, respectful salute in her direction. It happened, from there, in a rapid, cascading wave. A woman near him rose next, then two men beside her. Then, within the space of perhaps 10 seconds, all 30 veterans in the room had risen to their feet, many of them saluting, several with visible tears already forming, the entire gathered group turning, as one, to face the doorway where Grace Ellison stood, frozen, utterly unprepared for the specific, overwhelming scale of what was unfolding in front of her. The room fell completely, profoundly silent, the ordinary murmur of reception conversation entirely swallowed by the specific, weighty stillness of 30 people simultaneously acknowledging a debt they had each, individually, carried for years. "Captain Ellison," the first man said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with a clarity that made every syllable land. "We weren't sure you'd remember any of us. We wanted you to know we never forgot you." Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand rising almost involuntarily to cover her mouth, tears already gathering in her eyes despite her every effort to maintain composure in front of a room full of witnesses. She recognized him immediately, the years having changed his face only slightly. Master Sergeant Aaron Voss, whom she had personally kept alive for nearly 6 hours after a roadside explosion had nearly taken both his legs, talking to him continuously through the worst of it, refusing to let him lose consciousness before the surgical team could properly stabilize him. "Sergeant Voss," she managed, her voice breaking on his name. You're walking." "Because of you," Voss said simply. "All of us standing in this room right now, every single one of us is here, in one form or another, because you refused to let go of us when it would have been considerably easier to." Across the room, Preston Ainsley stood frozen among the hospital staff, his easy, confident bearing entirely gone, replaced by a specific, dawning horror as he watched 30 veterans stand at attention for a woman he had, 3 weeks earlier, publicly mocked as someone who'd merely learned to look busy in scrubs. The room slowly began to move again, the formal stillness giving way to something warmer, as veterans began approaching Grace individually, several of them embracing her, others simply taking her hand and holding it for a long moment, each one carrying their own specific piece of history with her that the room's collective silence hadn't fully captured. James Whitlow approached on his prosthetics, moving with a confident, practiced gait that spoke to years of successful rehabilitation, and pulled Grace into a careful, emotional hug. "I still have the letter I wrote you," he said. "Did you ever get it?" "I never knew for certain it reached you before you left the service." "I got it," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I still have it too. I've read it more times than I probably should admit." "You held my hand through 3 surgeries," Whitlow said. 11 hours. I remember every single one of them, even through the pain and the drugs. You never once let go, not even when the surgeons needed space to work. You just kept talking to me, kept telling me I was going to be okay. "You were going to be okay," Grace said. "I just needed you to believe it too, until your body caught up to the truth." "I run marathons now," Whitlow added, a proud, almost boyish grin breaking across his face. "Adaptive division, obviously, but still. I ran my first one 2 years after the surgeries, and I thought about you crossing that finish line because I kept remembering what you told me in the OR, that being scared didn't mean I couldn't also be strong at the exact same time. I've carried that with me through every single race since." Grace felt fresh tears gathering, the specific, overwhelming pride of watching someone she had once fought to keep alive build something so genuinely triumphant out of the aftermath. "I'd love to see you race sometime," she said, "if that's ever something you'd be comfortable with." "I'll send you the schedule," Whitlow said. "I mean that. I want you there, if you're willing to come." Denise Okafor was next, a woman now in her mid-30s, and she pulled a photograph from her bag before Grace had even finished embracing her. 2 children, a boy and a girl, both grinning at the camera. "This is Malik and Aisha," she said. You told me, that night, that my fear didn't have to become my future. I didn't fully believe you then. I believe you now, every single day, watching these two grow up. Grace took the photograph with trembling hands, studying the two children's faces with a specific, overwhelming tenderness. They're beautiful, she said. I'm so glad, Denise. I'm so genuinely glad. I named my daughter after my grandmother, Okafor added, but her middle name is Grace. I wanted you to know that, even if I never got the chance to actually tell you before today. You gave me back a future I genuinely believed. That night, I'd already lost. Grace felt her composure nearly break entirely at that revelation, tears now falling freely as she embraced Okafor a second time. I don't know what to say to that, she admitted. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for trusting me enough, back then, to let me sit with you through that fear. Marcus Delgado, now in his mid-20s, approached last among this initial wave, considerably more reserved than the others, and simply stood in front of Grace for a long moment before speaking. I don't know if you remember specifically, he began. I remember you, Grace interrupted gently. 18 years old. You lost your friend that day. I held you for a long time that night. Delgado's composure broke entirely at that, tears falling freely as he embraced her. I think about that night more than almost anything else from my deployment, he said. Not the explosion, not even losing him, though I think about that too, obviously. I think about you not rushing me to stop crying. Everyone else wanted me to be strong immediately. You just let me be exactly as broken as I actually was, for as long as I needed to be. You didn't need to perform strength for me, Grace said. You needed to actually grieve. There's a difference, and I've watched too many people get denied the second one in favor of demanding the first. I went into social work eventually, Delgado added, wiping his eyes. Grief counseling specifically, for other veterans. I don't think I would have found that path without watching how you handled mine that night. You taught me what real support actually looks like, without ever meaning to teach me anything at all. Grace felt a fresh wave of emotion move through her at that, understanding, in the specific way that mattered most to her, that her impact had rippled forward into considerably more lives than even this remarkable room fully represented. That's one of the best things anyone's ever told me, she said. I'm proud of you, Marcus. Genuinely, deeply proud. Preston Ainsley watched this unfold from a distance, unable to look away. The specific, cumulative weight of 30 individual testimonials assembling into a picture of Grace Ellison that bore almost no resemblance to the quiet, easily dismissed target he had spent 8 months treating as beneath his serious consideration. It was Master Sergeant Voss who eventually noticed Ainsley standing apart from the crowd, his discomfort visible enough that Voss, moving toward the refreshment table on his prosthetic legs, found himself curious enough to approach him directly. Voss had a specific gift, honed over years of both military leadership and his subsequent work in veterans outreach, for reading exactly the kind of discomfort Ainsley was currently, unsuccessfully, trying to conceal. You work with her? Voss asked, nodding toward where Grace was still surrounded by several more veterans waiting their turn to greet her. I do, Ainsley said, his usual confident bearing considerably diminished. I'm Dr. Preston Ainsley, orthopedic surgery. Aaron Voss, the sergeant said, extending a hand, which Ainsley shook with visible discomfort. I owe her my legs. Not figuratively, literally. She kept me talking, kept me conscious, kept me from bleeding out on a table in the middle of nowhere for 6 hours, until a surgical team could actually operate. I've met a lot of impressive medical professionals in my life, Doctor. She's near the top of that list, and it's not a short list. Ainsley absorbed this in uncomfortable silence, some part of him already understanding, with dawning clarity, exactly where this conversation was heading. Word travels in the veteran community, Voss continued, his tone remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath the civility. "One of our members works administrative support here. She mentioned, during our planning calls, that Grace has had a rough go of it with a colleague who likes to make jokes about nurses being less serious than doctors. Didn't put a name to it at the time. I'm starting to get a pretty clear picture now." Ainsley started, uncertain how to finish the sentence. "I'm not here to lecture you, doctor," Voss said. "That's not really my place. And honestly, watching you stand over there looking like you've just seen a ghost tells me you're already doing plenty of that work internally without my help." He paused, studying Ainsley with the specific, direct assessment of someone who had spent years learning to read people quickly and accurately. "I'll just say this. Whatever you think you know about what makes someone impressive, whatever metric you've been using to decide who deserves your respect and who doesn't, I'd encourage you to reconsider it. Because the woman you've apparently spent months dismissing kept dozens of us alive in circumstances I genuinely hope you never have to understand firsthand. That's not a small thing. That's not a thing that deserves to be the punchline of a cafeteria joke." Ainsley stood in silence for a long moment, the specific, uncomfortable weight of the conversation settling over him with a finality that felt, in that moment, considerably more consequential than anything he had experienced in his professional career to date. "You're right," he said finally, his voice carrying none of his usual assured confidence. "I don't have a defense for what I've said to her. I didn't understand who I was talking to. I'm not sure that excuses it, but I want you to know I understand, right now, exactly how wrong I've been." "That's a start," Voss said. "What you do with it is what actually matters. She's a considerably more forgiving person than I'd probably be in her position. I'd suggest not wasting the specific grace she seems inclined to offer you." It took Ainsley nearly 20 minutes to work up the specific courage required to approach Grace directly, watching from a distance as she continued moving through the room, embracing veterans, wiping away tears, offering the same quiet, steady presence to each person that had apparently defined her entire military service. When the crowd around her finally thinned enough to allow a private moment, he crossed the room, uncertain exactly how to begin a conversation he had never anticipated needing to have. "Nurse Ellison," he said. "Grace, could I speak with you for a moment?" Grace turned to him, her expression carefully neutral, the specific composure she had maintained through 8 months of his comments settling back into place despite the emotional intensity of the preceding half hour. "Of course, doctor," she said. "I owe you an apology," Ainsley said, his voice carrying none of his usual confident cadence. "Not just for today. For the last 8 months, I've made you the subject of jokes I thought were harmless, and I understand now, watching what just happened in this room, exactly how far from harmless they actually were." Grace studied him for a long moment before responding, weighing her words with the same care she brought to everything. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I want to be honest with you, doctor. I've absorbed a lot of comments like yours over the years, from various people, and I've learned that most of them don't actually change anything about how the person treats me afterward. I'd rather see what happens next than accept an apology as the end of the conversation." "That's fair," Ainsley said. "More than fair, honestly, given what I've put you through." He paused, visibly searching for the right words. "I want you to know something, though, regardless of what happens going forward. I spent this morning listening to 30 different people describe what you did for them, and I don't think I've ever felt smaller in my entire career than I did standing here watching that unfold. You've done things I can't even fully comprehend, professionally, and I mocked you for not being serious enough. I don't have a way to adequately express how ashamed that makes me. Thank you for saying it plainly," Grace said. "That matters more than you probably realize. A lot of people, in my experience, try to soften an apology into something that doesn't actually require them to sit with the full weight of what they did. I appreciate that you're not doing that. I don't think I deserve credit for simply being honest about something this clear," Ainsley said. "But I'll take whatever chance you're willing to give me to actually be different going forward, if you're willing to extend one. Grace considered this for a long moment, the specific weighing calculation of someone deciding how much trust to extend to a person who had, until very recently, given her little reason to expect genuine change. "I'll give you the chance," she said finally. "Not because you've earned it yet, because I think everyone deserves the opportunity to prove they can actually be different, if they're genuinely willing to try. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." "That's more generosity than I expected," Ainsley admitted. "It's not unlimited generosity," Grace said, something firmer entering her voice. "I'd ask that you understand that clearly. This isn't a blank check. It's a starting point. I'll be watching, same as everyone else in this hospital who witnessed what just happened here." Dr. Kwan, having observed the entire scene from near the cafeteria's entrance, found Grace during a brief lull in the reception, her own expression carrying a specific, quiet awe that hadn't fully faded since the moment 30 veterans had risen to their feet in unison. "I don't think I've ever witnessed anything quite like that," Dr. Kwan said. "I want you to know, Grace, that this hospital owes you an accounting of its own, separate from whatever Dr. Ainsley has offered. We've had you on staff for 8 months without ever fully understanding the caliber of the person we hired." "You hired a competent nurse," Grace said. "That part was always true, regardless of what came before it." "You hired considerably more than a competent nurse," Dr. Kwan said. "And I intend to make sure this hospital's administration formally recognizes that, properly, rather than letting today become simply a remarkable story people tell each other in the break room for a few weeks, before moving on to the next thing." She paused. "I'd like your permission to formally update your personnel file to reflect your full service record, and I'd like to discuss, when you're ready, whether you'd be interested in a more prominent role here, mentoring newer staff, perhaps helping develop our trauma response protocols. I think this hospital would benefit enormously from your specific expertise in a considerably more visible capacity than you've occupied so far." Grace considered this carefully, weighing the specific, complicated calculus of a life she had spent 2 years deliberately keeping quiet and unremarkable. "I'd be open to discussing it," she said finally. "I don't want the recognition to become the point, though. I came here to do good, ordinary work, quietly. I'd want any expanded role to genuinely serve the hospital and the staff, not just serve as a kind of institutional trophy for having employed someone with an impressive service record." "I understand completely," Dr. Kwan said. "And I want to be clear, whatever we discuss going forward is entirely on your terms. Today wasn't engineered by this hospital to create a spectacle. It happened because 30 people who owe you their lives wanted the chance to say so. What we do with that going forward should honor that authenticity, not exploit it." Word of the morning's events spread through Ridgefield County Hospital with the particular speed of genuinely remarkable stories, reaching staff who hadn't been present within hours, and by the following day, the specific, quiet transformation in how colleagues treated Grace had already become noticeable. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but a steady, cumulative shift in the ordinary texture of her daily interactions. Nurses who had previously treated her with polite but distant professionalism began seeking her out more genuinely, asking questions about her service history with a respectful curiosity that felt considerably different from the careful avoidance most staff had previously extended around the topic. Residents who had laughed along with Ainsley's jokes, uncomfortable but unwilling to risk becoming his next target, approached her individually over the following days to offer quiet, private apologies for their complicity, acknowledging, in various careful phrasings, that they had understood at the time that the comments weren't fair, even if they'd lacked the courage to say so publicly. Grace absorbed all of this with the same measured composure she brought to everything, neither seeking out the attention nor entirely avoiding the conversations that came her way, understanding that the hospital's culture around her had shifted in ways that would take considerably longer than a single dramatic morning to fully settle into something sustainable. Not every soldier Grace had treated during her 6 years of service had survived, and the weight of that particular truth had followed her, quietly and persistently, into every subsequent chapter of her life, including the emotional aftermath of the health fair, which had brought back not just the faces of the people she'd saved, but, inevitably, the memory of those she hadn't been able to. The specific loss that Grace carried most heavily was a young specialist named Tyler Brennan, 20 years old, who had arrived at her forward surgical unit with injuries so severe that even the most aggressive intervention had offered only a narrow chance of survival. She had worked on him for nearly 4 hours, refusing to accept the mounting evidence that the outcome was likely already determined, continuing to fight for him with the same fierce, stubborn determination she brought to every patient, right up until the moment his heart finally, permanently stopped, despite everything the surgical team had attempted. She had sat with his body afterward for several minutes longer than protocol strictly required, unable to immediately transition back into the demands of the unit's relentless flow of incoming wounded, allowing herself, in that brief private moment, to grieve a young man she had known for less than half a day, but had fought for with everything she had. She had written to his family months later, once she'd worked up the emotional capacity to do so, describing his final hours with as much honest, gentle detail as she believed they could bear, that he had not been alone, that she had stayed with him through every moment, that his final words had been about his younger sister, whom he'd apparently promised, before his deployment, that he would be home in time for her high school graduation. Brennan's mother had written back, eventually, a brief but deeply moving letter thanking Grace for the specific details she had shared, for the honesty of the account, and for simply being present with her son when his family could not be. Grace had kept that letter alongside the others in her small box of memories, though she opened it considerably less often than the letters from soldiers who had survived, because the specific grief attached to it remained, even years later, close enough to the surface to make the reading genuinely difficult. She thought about Tyler Brennan often in the days following the health fair, understanding that his absence from the group of 30 veterans who had honored her that morning was its own kind of presence, the specific, permanent reminder that her service, however meaningful to the people she'd saved, had also cost her considerably, in ways that no amount of grateful embraces or standing ovations could fully offset. She had learned, over the years since leaving the Army, to hold both truths simultaneously: the genuine, profound satisfaction of having saved so many lives, and the equally genuine, permanent grief of the ones she hadn't been able to. She did not believe, and had never believed, that the first truth erased or diminished the second. She had simply learned, through considerable effort, to carry them both without letting either one consume her entirely. Preston Ainsley, in the days following the health fair, made a specific, deliberate effort to understand more fully what Grace's service had actually entailed. Reading what publicly available information he could find about combat nursing and forward surgical teams, watching documentaries about military medical care that he would never previously have thought to seek out, driven by a genuine desire to close the considerable gap between his previous careless assumptions and the actual reality of what Grace had experienced. He found her in the staff lounge one afternoon, roughly a week after the health fair, and approached with a specific, careful humility that had characterized nearly all of his interactions with her since that day. "I've been reading about forward surgical teams," he said. "I wanted you to know I've been trying to actually understand what you did, rather than just apologizing without any real comprehension of what I was apologizing for." Grace looked up from her chart, something in her expression shifting into genuine, if still cautious, appreciation. "That's more effort than most people put in," she said. "I keep thinking about the numbers," Ainsley said. "The survival rates in forward surgical care, historically, compared to what they've become with teams like the one you served on, the difference is staggering. I don't think I fully appreciated, before this, how much that difference actually represents, in terms of real people, Real families. He paused, something more searching in his expression. I also read about the psychological toll on the medical personnel themselves. I hadn't fully considered that part before, honestly. I'd focused entirely on the wounded soldiers, without thinking much about what it cost the people treating them, over and over, deployment after deployment. It costs considerably more than most people outside that world ever fully understand, Grace said quietly. More than I usually let myself think about in a single sitting, honestly. I'm not trying to make this about me, Ainsley said. I just wanted you to know I'm taking the effort to actually understand seriously, not just the apology part. I've noticed, Grace said. It matters. I want you to know that. 2 months after the health fair, Grace accepted Dr. Kwan's proposal to take on an expanded role at Ridgefield County Hospital, developing a formal trauma response training program specifically designed to help the hospital's staff, particularly newer nurses and residents, build the kind of composure and clinical judgment under pressure that Grace herself had spent years developing in circumstances considerably more extreme than a civilian hospital typically presented. She approached the role with the same careful, deliberate thoughtfulness she brought to everything, insisting that the program focus on genuinely useful skill building rather than becoming, as she'd initially worried, a kind of institutional showcase built around her personal story rather than practical value for the staff involved. Among the first nurses to go through her training was a second-year staff member named Olivia Marsh, sharp but visibly anxious during high-pressure situations, whose confidence had been quietly eroded over her first 2 years by a series of small, unaddressed moments of self-doubt that had never fully resolved into genuine competence. Olivia had, in fact, been present in the cafeteria the day of Ainsley's original comment about Grace, and had privately felt a specific, uncomfortable recognition of her own insecurities reflected in the exchange, though she had said nothing at the time, unwilling to draw Ainsley's attention toward herself. "I freeze sometimes," Olivia admitted to Grace during one of their early training sessions. "Not always, but when things get really chaotic, I sometimes just stop for a few seconds. I don't know how to make that stop happening." "Everyone freezes. The first several times the stakes feel genuinely overwhelming," Grace said. "I froze too, my first time in a truly extreme situation. What matters isn't whether you freeze, it's whether you build, deliberately and consistently, the specific muscle memory that lets you move through the freeze faster each time. That's not talent. That's practice, and it's exactly what this program is designed to help you build." "How long did it take you?" Olivia asked. "Longer than I'd like to admit," Grace said honestly. "I'm not going to pretend it happened quickly, because it wouldn't be true, and it wouldn't be useful to you either. But it did happen, gradually, through exactly the kind of deliberate scenario training I'm trying to build into this program. You freezing for a few seconds during a chaotic moment isn't a verdict on your capability. It's information about where your training currently is." Olivia absorbed this with visible relief, the specific unburdening of someone who had been carrying a harsher judgment on herself than the situation actually warranted. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that framed that way, instead of just as a personal failing." "It's not a failing," Grace said. "It's a starting point. There's a difference, and I've spent a lot of my own career learning to see it clearly." Preston Ainsley's own transformation over the following months proved, to Grace's cautious but genuine satisfaction, considerably more sustained than the kind of temporary contrition that sometimes followed a single dramatic reckoning. He began, gradually, restructuring several of his own long-standing assumptions about which colleagues deserved his serious professional respect, extending genuine curiosity and consideration to staff whose backgrounds he might previously have dismissed without examination. He also began, roughly 3 months after the health fair, volunteering periodically with the same Veterans Outreach organization that had brought the group to Ridgefield, an involvement he pursued quietly, without any particular effort to publicize it, driven by what he described to Grace, during one of their now occasional conversations, as a genuine desire to better understand the community he had so carelessly mischaracterized. "I don't expect that to erase what I said," he told her. "I just wanted to actually do something, rather than just feeling appropriately ashamed and moving on with my life, as though that were sufficient." "It's not nothing," Grace said. "I'd rather see consistent, ongoing effort like that than a single grand gesture designed to close the book on the whole thing. This is the kind of change that actually means something." 4 months after the health fair, Ridgefield County Hospital faced an unexpected test of the trauma response training Grace had spent months building. A serious multi-vehicle accident on the highway adjacent to the hospital during evening rush hour, sending a wave of critical patients toward an emergency department that had, historically, struggled with exactly the kind of sudden, overwhelming surge this particular accident produced. Grace, working an ordinary evening shift when the alert came through, found herself naturally stepping into a coordination role as the department's capacity strained under the incoming wave of patients, her calm, precise direction cutting through the initial chaos with the same trained clarity that had defined her entire military career. Olivia Marsh, now several months into her training under Grace's mentorship, worked directly alongside her during the response, and where she might once have frozen under the specific pressure of a genuinely severe crisis, she instead moved with a controlled, deliberate focus that surprised even herself, executing triage protocols with a confidence that spoke directly to the months of deliberate practice Grace had helped her build. Preston Ainsley, called in from home to assist with the surge given the severity of several patients' orthopedic injuries, worked alongside Grace with a genuine, collaborative trust that would have seemed entirely unimaginable 8 months earlier, incorporating her assessments into his surgical decisions without any trace of his old reflexive dismissiveness. "Your triage sequencing is holding," he told her, roughly 90 minutes into the response, something like genuine admiration threading through his voice. "I've been practicing orthopedic surgery for 2 decades, and I've never seen a mass casualty response at this hospital handled with this little friction between clinical priorities and coordination." "It's not just coordination," Grace said. "It's trust. We're not fighting each other for authority anymore. That's the actual difference from before." The accident ultimately produced 17 patients requiring hospital treatment, several of them in critical condition, and Ridgefield's response absorbed the surge with an efficiency that drew formal recognition from regional emergency management as a marked improvement over the hospital's historical performance in comparable situations. A result that both Grace and Ainsley understood, without needing to say it aloud to each other, traced directly back to the specific, hard-won transformation of the hospital's culture over the preceding 4 months. In the midst of the response, Grace encountered a moment that crystallized, for her, exactly how much the hospital's environment had genuinely shifted since the health fair. A frightened family member, distraught over a loved one's critical condition, lashed out verbally at a young resident attempting to explain the situation, and Ainsley, rather than simply managing the clinical situation and leaving the emotional fallout to nursing staff as he might once have done, took a genuine, deliberate moment to sit with the family member himself, offering the same patient, careful presence Grace had modeled for the hospital's culture over the preceding months. "I learned that from watching you," he told Grace afterward, somewhat sheepishly. "I used to think that kind of emotional support wasn't really my job. I've come to understand it's actually part of the job, whether or not it's the part I was formally trained for." "That's exactly the shift I was hoping this training would eventually produce," Grace said. "Not just better clinical judgment, a genuinely different understanding of what good patient care actually requires." 6 months after the health fair, Ridgefield County Hospital's administration organized a formal recognition ceremony. Driven by a combination of Dr. Kwan's genuine desire to properly honor Grace's contributions and a growing regional awareness of the hospital's remarkable trauma response transformation, which had drawn attention from several other healthcare institutions curious about replicating similar results. The ceremony took place in the same cafeteria where the Veterans Health Fair had unfolded 6 months earlier, filled well beyond its ordinary capacity, with hospital staff, several members of hospital administration, representatives from regional healthcare organizations, and, at Grace's specific request, a smaller contingent of the veterans who had attended the original health fair, including Aaron Voss, James Whitlow, and Denise Okafor. Marcus Delgado had sent his regrets, unable to travel for the ceremony due to graduate school commitments, but had written Grace a brief, heartfelt letter that Dr. Kwan read aloud as part of the proceedings, describing his own gratitude in words that moved several people in the room to tears before the formal recognition had even properly begun. Dr. Kwan opened the ceremony with a formal account of Grace's contributions to the hospital over the preceding year, describing both her military service and her subsequent work developing the trauma response training program that had, within 6 months, measurably improved the hospital's performance across numerous critical metrics. When Grace Ellison joined this hospital 8 months before that health fair, Dr. Kwan said, "She came to us with a personnel file that gave almost no indication of the caliber of clinician and leader we had actually hired. That was not deception. It was simply her choice to let her civilian work speak for itself, without the specific weight of her military history following her into every interaction. I think that choice speaks to her character as clearly as anything else about her service does." She paused, looking directly at Grace, seated near the front of the gathered crowd. 6 years of Army service, the final 3 as a combat nurse, attached to a forward surgical team, across 2 deployments. Dozens of soldiers who owe their lives, in whole or in part, to her skill and her refusal to give up on them, even in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And in the 8 months since I first learned the full scope of what she'd actually done, she has built, here at Ridgefield, a training program that has fundamentally transformed how this hospital responds to crisis, saving an incalculable number of additional lives through the ripple effects of the confidence and competence she's helped instill in our staff. The room absorbed this in a particular, respectful silence. The specific weight of an institution formally acknowledging a debt it had taken considerably too long to recognize. "On behalf of this hospital," Dr. Kwan continued, "I want to formally present Grace with our institution's highest civilian recognition, the Ridgefield Medal of Excellence, awarded, in this instance, not just for a single act of heroism, but for a sustained pattern of extraordinary service that has genuinely transformed how this hospital cares for its patients." Grace stood, moving to the front of the room with her usual quiet composure, though something in her expression, watching the assembled crowd, colleagues, administrators, and, most meaningfully to her, the veterans who had once stood for her in this exact room 6 months earlier, carried a specific, unguarded emotion she rarely allowed herself to show in front of an audience. Dr. Kwan pinned the medal to Grace's uniform, and the room erupted into sustained applause, led first by Aaron Voss, who rose to his feet with the same formal, deliberate respect he had shown 6 months earlier, quickly followed by the rest of the veterans present, and then, within moments, by the entire assembled crowd, staff and administrators alike, rising together in a standing ovation that lasted considerably longer than ceremonial applause typically did. Grace did not fully manage to hold back tears this time. The specific accumulated weight of the preceding 6 months finally fully allowed its proper emotional expression in front of the people who had witnessed both her humiliation and her vindication in the very same room. Preston Ainsley requested a moment to speak once the applause had settled, and Dr. Kwan, understanding the specific significance of the request, yielded the floor to him without hesitation. "I want to say something," he began, "that I've been trying to find the right words for since that morning 6 months ago, and I don't think I've ever fully managed it, though I've tried several times privately with Grace." He paused, gathering himself, the room's attention fully on him now. "I spent 8 months treating a colleague as beneath my serious professional respect, based on nothing more than careless assumptions I'd never bothered to actually examine. I made her the subject of jokes in front of our colleagues, jokes I genuinely believed, at the time, were harmless. I was profoundly, catastrophically wrong, and I learned exactly how wrong in the worst possible way, publicly, in front of 30 people who owed her their lives, while I stood there having contributed nothing but casual cruelty to her experience at this hospital." He looked directly at Grace. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand what I got wrong, not just about you specifically, but about the entire framework I'd built for deciding whose competence deserved my respect. I built that framework around credentials and titles, around the specific hierarchy I'd spent 20 years climbing, and it left almost no room for recognizing genuine excellence when it didn't announce itself the way I expected excellence to announce itself. You've spent 6 months proving that framework wrong in ways I'm going to be unlearning for the rest of my career." The room remained silent, absorbing the specific weight of a senior physician's genuine, public accounting of his own failure. "I don't know if this is the right moment to say this," Ainsley continued, "but I want it on the record, in this room, in front of everyone who witnessed both my failure and your extraordinary response to it. Grace Ellison is the finest clinician I have ever worked alongside, in 20 years of practicing medicine. I am considerably better at my own job and a considerably better colleague for having finally, belatedly learned to actually see her clearly." He stepped back, and Grace, moved by the specific, unflinching honesty of his account, crossed the small distance between them and extended her hand, which he shook with genuine, visible emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly, for his ears alone, though the gesture itself was visible to the entire room. That took real courage to say, in front of everyone. "It was considerably easier than the 8 months that preceded it should have been," Ainsley said. "I have a great deal of time to make up for." The ceremony concluded with a reception that extended well into the evening, veterans and hospital staff mingling with a warmth that had, over 6 months, become the new ordinary texture of Ridgefield County Hospital's culture, rather than a remarkable exception to it. Aaron Voss found Grace during a quiet moment, pulling her aside with the same direct, purposeful bearing he'd shown in his earlier conversation with Ainsley. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "Our organization's been talking, since the health fair, about formalizing a partnership with hospitals like this one, helping other veterans find quality trauma-informed care, using what happened here as a kind of model case. I'd like your input, if you're willing to give it, on how we might build that properly." Grace felt something warm move through her chest, the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of watching a single difficult morning ripple outward into something that might genuinely help considerably more people than she'd ever anticipated when she first walked through that cafeteria door 6 months earlier. "I'd be honored to help," she said. "Whatever that partnership needs, I want to be part of building it properly." "I had a feeling you'd say that," Voss said, something warm and knowing in his expression. "You never did know how to say no when people actually needed you. Some things, I'm glad to see, never change." 3 weeks after the recognition ceremony, prompted by a brief mention of the medal ceremony in a regional veterans newsletter that Voss's organization circulated, Grace received an unexpected letter from Tyler Brennan's mother, whom she had corresponded with only once, years earlier, in the aftermath of his death. The letter was brief but carried a specific, generous warmth that moved Grace considerably more than she'd initially expected. Brennan's mother wrote that she had seen the newsletter mention, had recognized Grace's name immediately from the letter she'd received years earlier, and wanted to reach out again, now that so much time had passed, to let Grace know that the family's gratitude for her care of Tyler in his final hours had never diminished, regardless of how many years separated them from that loss. "I know it's been a long time," the letter read, "and I don't want to intrude on whatever peace you've built since then. But I wanted you to know that reading about the wonderful things you've continued doing for so many other soldiers and their families brought me a specific kind of comfort I wasn't expecting. Tyler's death was the worst thing that ever happened to our family. But knowing that the woman who cared for him in his final hours has gone on to save so many others, and to build something so meaningful out of everything you experienced, that matters to us more than I can properly express in a letter." Grace read the letter several times, alone in her apartment, feeling the specific, complicated mixture of grief and gratitude that any mention of Tyler Brennan reliably brought forward in her, even years later. She wrote back carefully, over several days, sharing an update on her current work, on the training program, on the specific way that her service, including the parts that had cost her most, continued to inform everything she did now. She found herself, in the process of writing that letter, reflecting more deeply than she had in some time on the specific, complicated relationship between grief and purpose, between the losses that had shaped her and the good she had subsequently managed to build. She did not believe, and had never believed, that Tyler Brennan's death had somehow made her later successes more meaningful, or that any silver lining could adequately offset a young man's death. She believed, instead, something considerably more modest and more true, that carrying his memory forward, honestly and without erasing the pain of it, had simply become part of how she continued doing the work at all. 8 months after the health fair, Grace's trauma response training program had grown into something considerably larger than its original, modest scope. Other regional hospitals had begun requesting access to the curriculum. Several nursing schools had inquired about incorporating elements of her approach into their own training, and Ridgefield County Hospital had, almost inadvertently, become something of a regional model for the kind of institutional culture change that most healthcare administrators only theorized about rather than genuinely achieved. Grace found, in the months following the recognition ceremony, that her relationship with the work had settled into something she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd first accepted Dr. Kwan's proposal: a specific, sustainable integration of her military expertise and her civilian purpose that felt considerably more whole than the careful separation she'd maintained during her first 8 months at Ridgefield. She was not simply a quiet, competent nurse who happened to have an extraordinary past, nor was she purely the decorated trauma response coordinator her medal and expanding program might have suggested. She was, increasingly, both at once, moving fluidly between bedside patient care and institutional leadership in a way that drew on the full range of what she'd spent 9 years learning to do. Olivia Marsh, over those 8 months, continued the specific, steady growth that had characterized her development since beginning Grace's training, eventually taking on a formal assistant role within the expanding program, teaching newer staff many of the same lessons Grace had once taught her, closing a specific loop of mentorship that Grace found, watching it unfold, deeply satisfying in a way that had little to do with her own recognition, and everything to do with the broader resilience she'd set out to build. "I used to think competence meant never freezing," Olivia told a group of new nursing hires during one of her own training sessions 8 months after the health fair, echoing almost exactly the framing Grace had once offered her. "It doesn't. It means building the specific muscle memory that lets you move through the freeze faster, every time, through deliberate practice rather than natural talent. That's not a lesser kind of competence. It's the only kind that's actually sustainable, long-term under real pressure." Grace, observing from the back of the room, felt something warm move through her chest. The specific, uncomplicated pride of watching a lesson she'd once received herself, years earlier, continue forward into an entirely new generation of nurses who would likely never fully understand the full chain of mentorship that had shaped the framing they were now receiving as simple, practical wisdom. Preston Ainsley's transformation, over the year following the health fair, continued in ways that surprised even Grace, who had initially extended him a cautious, provisional trust that she hadn't been entirely certain would prove justified. He became, gradually, one of the training program's most consistent advocates within the hospital's physician staff, encouraging fellow doctors to participate in sessions they might once have dismissed as unnecessary for already credentialed professionals. "I keep catching myself," he admitted to Grace, during one of their now regular collaborative planning sessions, roughly a year after the health fair. "The old instinct, the reflexive certainty that my judgment doesn't benefit from other people's input, especially people whose credentials or background don't immediately signal the kind of expertise I was trained to recognize. It hasn't disappeared just because I've built better habits around catching it." "That's honest," Grace said. "And it matches something I'd have told you myself, months ago. I don't think the instinct fully disappears for most people. I think the goal is building enough awareness that it doesn't get to run the show unchecked. From what I've watched over this past year, you've actually managed that, consistently, even on the days the old instinct tries to reassert itself." "That's a more generous assessment than I probably deserve," Ainsley said. "It's an accurate one," Grace said. "I don't need you to be perfect for the change to be real, Preston. I need you to be consistently better than you were, and consistently accountable when you're not. That's what I've actually watched happen." Ainsley absorbed this with the particular gravity of someone genuinely moved by an assessment he hadn't fully expected to receive. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest instead of just being kind about it." "They're not mutually exclusive," Grace said. "Most things people assume are opposites usually aren't, if you look closely enough." A year and a half after the health fair, Ainsley approached Grace with a specific, unexpected proposal. He wanted to formally co-author, alongside her, a paper examining the specific institutional culture changes that had followed the health fair, intended for publication in a healthcare administration journal, with the explicit goal of helping other institutions understand how to build similar transformations without requiring, as he put it, the specific, painful catalyst of a senior physician's public humiliation. "I want other hospitals to learn from what happened here," he told her, "without necessarily needing their own version of the mistake I made to get there. I think there's real value in documenting what actually worked, systematically, rather than just letting it remain a remarkable story people tell informally." Grace considered the proposal carefully, recognizing in it something genuinely different from the performative gestures that sometimes followed institutional embarrassment. A specific, sustained commitment to building something that would outlast the particular circumstances that had prompted it. "I'll co-author it," she said, "on the condition that we're honest about the full story, including your role in it. I don't want this to become a sanitized case study that erases the actual, difficult mechanics of how institutional change happens. I think the uncomfortable parts are exactly what makes it useful to other institutions." "I agree completely," Ainsley said. "I don't want to hide my own failure in this. If anything, I think it's the most instructive part of the whole account, for anyone reading it who recognizes similar patterns in their own behavior." The paper, once published, drew considerable attention within the healthcare administration field, generating a steady stream of inquiries from other institutions interested in developing similar training programs and, more significantly to Grace, several personal messages from other nurses and medical professionals who described recognizing their own experiences of dismissal and eventual vindication in the story Grace and Ainsley had documented together. One message in particular stayed with Grace long after she received it. A nurse from a hospital several states away, describing a nearly identical pattern of casual dismissiveness from a senior colleague, writing that reading Grace and Ainsley's account had given her the specific courage to finally address the pattern directly with hospital administration, rather than continuing to simply absorb it quietly, as she had for years. "I don't have 30 veterans who are going to stand up for me," the nurse wrote. "But reading your story helped me understand that I don't need a dramatic moment like that to know my own worth, or to insist that my colleagues finally recognize it too." Grace read that message several times, feeling a specific, quiet satisfaction, considerably different from the more public forms of recognition she'd received. The particular, understated confirmation that her story had helped someone she would likely never meet find her own version of the clarity and courage that the health fair had, somewhat unexpectedly, given her. Grace's own daily rhythm at Ridgefield, over that first year and a half following the health fair, settled into a pattern that felt, to her, considerably more integrated and sustainable than the careful separation she'd maintained during her first 8 months at the hospital. She still woke early, still maintained the specific, deliberate discipline of a morning run that had characterized her entire adult life, a habit carried forward from her military training that she found continued to offer the same steadying, meditative benefit it always had. But the careful distance she'd once kept from colleagues, the deliberate vagueness about her history, the constant low-grade caution about which version of herself was safe to bring into any given room, all of that had, gradually, given way to something considerably more whole. She found herself, on quiet mornings before her shift, occasionally reflecting on the specific journey that had brought her to this particular equilibrium. 6 years of Army service that had built extraordinary capability at genuine personal cost, 2 years of careful civilian anonymity that had offered real but incomplete peace, and then a single, extraordinary morning that had forced her, in the space of an hour, to finally integrate both halves of who she was, rather than keeping them permanently, artificially separate. She maintained her small apartment near the hospital, still swam occasionally, though she had, in recent months, developed a specific fondness for a nearby hiking trail that offered the same solitary, restorative quality she'd once found in swimming. She had built, over the preceding year, a small number of genuine friendships among the Ridgefield staff, considerably deeper and more authentic than the careful, guarded relationships she'd maintained during her first 8 months. Friendships built on the specific foundation of colleagues who now understood, and genuinely respected, the full shape of who she actually was. She did not know, on any given morning, exactly what the day would ask of her, whether it would be an ordinary shift of bedside patient care, a training session with Olivia, or one of the other nurses moving through her program, a planning meeting related to the growing veterans partnership Voss had proposed, or, occasionally, the specific demand of an actual crisis requiring every ounce of expertise she'd spent 9 years building. She found, increasingly, that she no longer needed to know in advance. She had built, finally, a version of herself capable of meeting whatever the day actually required, without needing to keep any part of that capability carefully hidden from the people around her. 2 years after the health fair, Ridgefield hosted a regional healthcare conference specifically focused on trauma response training, drawing hospital administrators and clinical educators from across the state to study the framework Grace had built, a program that had, by that point, become something of a model case within the broader field of healthcare education. Grace presented the core elements of her training program to a room of considerably more experienced healthcare administrators, many of whom had spent decades in the field, and carried, in certain unguarded moments, a visible skepticism about what a hospital nurse, however decorated, could genuinely teach them about institutional culture change at scale. She addressed that skepticism directly, early in her presentation, rather than allowing it to remain an unspoken undercurrent throughout the session. "I understand some of you are wondering what a civilian hospital's nursing staff can teach a room full of experienced healthcare administrators," she said, scanning the room with the same steady, unflinching directness that had once unsettled colleagues who expected visible strain during a crisis. I'd ask you to consider that the framework I'm about to walk you through wasn't built by a civilian nurse working from theory. It was built by someone who spent 3 years delivering combat trauma care under conditions that tested every element of what genuine composure under pressure actually requires. Adapted specifically for civilian hospital contexts because I believed, and continue to believe, that the fundamental principles of effective trauma response don't actually change much based on whether the crisis is combat-related or a civilian mass casualty event. What changes is the specific operational context, not the underlying logic of how to build genuine confidence and competence under maximum strain. The room's skepticism by the end of her presentation had largely given way to genuine engagement, a shift Grace had witnessed enough times over the preceding 2 years to recognize as a familiar, satisfying pattern. The specific transition from doubt to respect that happened reliably once people encountered the actual substance of her expertise, rather than simply their initial assumptions about a nurse's presumed limitations. A senior healthcare administrator from a hospital system several states away approached her after the session, genuinely impressed. "I came in expecting a fairly basic overview," he admitted. "I'm leaving with 3 specific changes I want to implement in our own trauma response framework by next quarter." That's not something that happens often at these conferences, frankly. "I appreciate you saying that," Grace said, "and I'd be glad to consult further if it would help your team implement those changes properly rather than just conceptually." Grace's own history in the years before the Army had never been particularly remarkable. A middle-class upbringing in a small Midwestern town, a mother who worked as a hospital administrator, and a father who taught high school biology, neither of them with any military background that might have explained her eventual path. She had been, by her own later account, a fairly ordinary teenager, more interested in competitive cross-country running and volunteering at a local animal shelter than in any particular vision of her future career. She had, in fact, briefly considered veterinary medicine before ultimately settling on nursing, a decision shaped in part by watching her mother's administrative work at a regional hospital and developing, through those observations, a genuine fascination with the specific, immediate impact of direct patient care compared to the more removed administrative work her mother had chosen. She had excelled in her nursing coursework with the same quiet, understated diligence that would later characterize her entire career. Never the flashiest student in any given class, but consistently, reliably, among the most competent. The decision to enlist had come somewhat unexpectedly during her final year of nursing school, driven by a combination of restlessness and a specific, stubborn conviction that she wanted to test herself against something considerably more demanding than the civilian nursing career track she'd been quietly, comfortably drifting toward. Her parents had been startled by the decision, though ultimately supportive, understanding, even in their surprise, that their daughter had always possessed a quiet, determined resolve that rarely bent to easy persuasion once she'd genuinely made up her mind about something. She had entered officer training with the same understated, unflashy determination that would eventually come to define her entire career. Never the loudest person in any room, but consistently, reliably, the one whose judgment proved correct when it actually mattered. She had excelled quickly, distinguishing herself during her initial deployment cycle with the same combination of technical skill and unflappable composure that had characterized her work at Ridgefield, and had been selected, at 25, for the considerably more demanding role of combat nurse attached to a forward surgical team. She had managed the specific psychological weight of that role across 3 years and 2 deployments, with a consistency that had earned her a reputation within her units as someone whose calm was not performance but genuine, hard-won discipline, the specific product of years spent deliberately building the capacity to function fully even when everything in a given moment argued for panic instead. Her parents, both still living, had attended the recognition ceremony 6 months after the health fair, watching with visible, overwhelming pride as their daughter received formal acknowledgement for a chapter of her life she had, for years, discussed with them only in the most careful, limited detail. "I always knew you'd done something remarkable over there," her mother told her after the ceremony, tears still visible in her eyes. "You never talked about the specifics much, and we never pushed, because we understood you needed that distance. But watching those veterans today, watching what they said about you, I don't think I fully understood, until today, the actual scale of what you accomplished. I didn't want you carrying that weight alongside me," Grace admitted. "I think I convinced myself that keeping the details vague was protecting you, when really, I think it was mostly protecting myself from having to relive it in the telling." "You don't have to protect us anymore," her father said gently. "Whatever you're ready to share, whenever you're ready to share it. We want to understand the whole of who our daughter actually became out there, not just the parts that are easy to hear." Grace had, in the months following that conversation, begun sharing considerably more with her parents about her military years than she ever had before, finding, in the specific act of finally speaking those experiences aloud to the people who had raised her, another small but meaningful piece of the broader integration she had spent the preceding year building across every part of her life. 3 years after the health fair, Aaron Voss visited Ridgefield again, this time not as part of a formal organizational visit, but simply as a friend, having maintained a steady, genuine correspondence with Grace in the years since their reunion, one that had evolved into a friendship considerably deeper than the specific circumstances of their original connection might have suggested. "I wanted to see how the program's doing," he told her. Though both of them understood, the visit carried a warmth that extended well beyond simple professional curiosity. "And honestly, I just wanted to see you. It's been too long since the last visit." "It has," Grace agreed. "Come see the training facility. We've expanded considerably since you were last here." She walked him through the hospital's newly dedicated training center, a space that Ridgefield's administration had built specifically to house the program's growing curriculum, complete with simulation equipment and a small memorial wall Grace had insisted on including, photographs and brief tributes to several of the soldiers she'd treated who hadn't survived, including Tyler Brennan, whose photograph occupied a place of particular prominence among the display. Voss studied the memorial wall for a long moment, something solemn moving across his expression. "This is a good thing you've built," he said. "Not just the training, this too. Making sure the ones who didn't make it stay part of the story, instead of getting quietly erased in favor of the more comfortable narrative about the ones who survived." "I couldn't build this program honestly without including them," Grace said. "The losses are as much a part of what taught me how to do this work as the successes were. Maybe more, in some ways." "I think that's exactly right," Voss said. "And I think it's part of why this program actually works, when so many others like it end up feeling hollow. You're not selling people an easy story about heroism. You're teaching them the full, complicated truth about what this work actually costs, and what it's worth anyway." 4 years after the health fair, Ridgefield County Hospital's trauma response training program had become one of the most widely respected regional models of its kind, drawing formal recognition from state healthcare quality boards and generating a steady, ongoing partnership with the Veterans Outreach Organization Voss represented, a partnership that had, by that point, helped connect dozens of veterans across the region with quality, trauma-informed civilian healthcare. Olivia Marsh, now a senior nurse in her own right, had taken over primary leadership of the day-to-day training program, allowing Grace to focus increasingly on the broader institutional consulting work that had grown out of her original, modest proposal to Dr. Kwan years earlier, work that now took her periodically to other hospitals across the region and, occasionally, to healthcare conferences considerably further afield. Olivia's own leadership style, Grace noted with quiet satisfaction, had developed a distinctive character of its own over the years, retaining the fundamental principles Grace had originally taught her while incorporating Olivia's own particular warmth and directness, a specific evolution that Grace found genuinely gratifying to witness, rather than any diminishment of her own original contribution. "I never expected any of this," Grace admitted to Preston Ainsley, during one of their now regular collaborative check-ins, roughly 4 years after the health fair. "When I started here, I just wanted to do quiet, competent work and let the rest of my history stay carefully separate. I never imagined it would eventually become this." "Do you regret how it happened?" Ainsley asked. "The specific, public way everything came out?" Grace considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things. "I don't think I would have chosen it, if given the option in advance," she admitted. "I think I'd have preferred something quieter, more gradual. But I've come to believe that the specific, dramatic way it happened is part of what made the resulting change so genuine and so sustained. A quieter revelation might not have forced the same reckoning, for you or for the broader hospital culture. Sometimes the path you wouldn't have chosen turns out to be exactly the one that actually works. I think about that morning often," Ainsley said. "Not with shame anymore, particularly, though I certainly felt that at the time. More with a kind of gratitude, strange as that sounds, for the specific clarity it gave me about who I actually wanted to become, professionally and personally." "What do you think you'd have become if that morning had never happened?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. Ainsley considered the question with visible seriousness. "Probably a more skilled version of exactly what I already was," he said. "A competent surgeon who never fully examined his own blind spots, who continued treating certain colleagues as beneath his consideration without ever facing consequences significant enough to force real change. I don't think I'd have become a worse doctor necessarily. I think I'd have remained a smaller version of the doctor I've since become in ways that would have quietly cost my patients and colleagues more than I'd ever have recognized." "That's a considerably more honest answer than most people manage," Grace said. "I've had a lot of practice being honest with myself these past 4 years," Ainsley said. "You could say it's become something of a specialty." "That's not strange," Grace said. "I think most genuine transformation requires some version of that clarity, usually delivered in a form considerably more uncomfortable than we'd have chosen for ourselves." On a quiet Tuesday morning, 4 years after 30 veterans had risen to their feet the moment Grace Ellison walked into Ridgefield's cafeteria, she arrived for her regular shift, checked her assignments, and began, once again, the quiet, essential work that had always been the truest core of who she was, regardless of whatever additional responsibilities and recognition had accumulated around it over the preceding 4 years. Her first patient that morning was an elderly man admitted overnight with a suspected cardiac event, frightened in the particular quiet way elderly patients often were. Grace sat with him for a few extra minutes before her rounds officially required her elsewhere, answering questions patiently, adjusting his blanket, offering the same steady, unhurried reassurance she brought to every frightened patient, whether they were an ordinary cardiac case or one of the hundreds of soldiers whose lives she had once held, quite literally, in her own 2 hands. It did not matter to her, in the end, which kind of patient was in front of her, or which version of her expertise a given day happened to require. That had never been the point. The point had always been showing up, paying attention, doing the work in front of her, with the full weight of everything she'd learned across 9 years, and 2 entirely different but equally genuine versions of medical service. Preston Ainsley passed her in the hallway on his way to a morning consult, and instead of the careless dismissiveness that had once characterized nearly every interaction between them, he simply nodded, a small, genuine acknowledgement between colleagues and, increasingly, friends who had weathered something significant together and come out the other side with a considerably more honest understanding of each other. "Morning, Grace," he said, the greeting carrying nothing more than simple, settled warmth. The way genuine respect eventually settles into a relationship once every earlier assumption has been thoroughly, permanently corrected. "Morning, Preston," Grace said, continuing down the hall toward her first patient of the day, her honey-blonde hair catching the fluorescent light, her pace unhurried, her attention already, entirely, on the work in front of her. She thought, sometimes, on quiet mornings like this one, about the specific arc that had brought her to exactly this point. 6 years of Army service that had cost her more than she'd fully understood at the time. 2 years of careful civilian anonymity that had offered real but incomplete peace. And then a single extraordinary morning that had forced her, in the space of an hour, to finally stop keeping the two halves of her history artificially separate. She thought about Tyler Brennan, about the specific weight of a loss that had never stopped shaping how she approached every subsequent patient. She thought about James Whitlow walking on his prosthetics, about Denise Okafor's 2 children, about Marcus Delgado finally allowing himself to grieve without needing to perform strength he didn't yet feel. She thought about Olivia Marsh, about the specific kind of legacy that mattered to her considerably more than any medal or formal recognition. The particular satisfaction of watching competence and confidence spread outward from a single difficult morning into something that would likely outlast her own individual presence at Ridgefield by decades. She thought about Preston Ainsley, about the specific, sustained work of genuine institutional change, about how rarely such change happened easily or gracefully, and about how genuinely proud she'd become, over 4 years of watching him work, of a colleague who had faced the full weight of his own worst professional moment and chosen, consistently, to become someone measurably better in its aftermath. She was not, in the end, a legend, whatever the hospital's ongoing institutional memory had eventually made of her story in the years since that first extraordinary morning. She was a nurse, and, increasingly, something more than that, a mentor and consultant, whose expertise now extended well beyond Ridgefield's walls. But underneath every additional title and every accumulated responsibility, she remained, fundamentally, exactly what she had always been, someone who believed, without complication, that the person in front of her mattered, that their survival was worth whatever it cost her personally to secure it, and that this commitment had never once required anyone else's permission or anyone else's belief in her competence to be genuinely, permanently true. Preston Ainsley understood that now, in a way he hadn't 4 years earlier, when he'd looked at a quiet, pretty nurse with honey-blonde hair and soft hazel eyes and decided, without ever actually examining the assumption, that she had simply learned to look busy in scrubs, unworthy of his serious professional consideration. He understood, watching her walk down that hallway on an ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly how much he had missed during those first 8 months, and exactly how much he still had left to learn from a woman who had never once needed his approval, or anyone else's, to know precisely who she was. Somewhere, in a formal Army record that captured only a fraction of the full weight of what she'd actually done across 9 years of service in 2 entirely different but equally genuine capacities, the citation for her Ridgefield Medal of Excellence sat quietly alongside a considerably longer, mostly unwritten history. The soldiers she had saved, the one she couldn't, the years of careful civilian rebuilding that followed, the single extraordinary morning that had forced everything back into the open, and the 4 years since that had, patiently, deliberately, woven both halves of her history into something considerably more whole than either version alone had ever managed to be. No single document would ever capture the entirety of who Grace Ellison actually was. No document ever could. But the 30 veterans who had risen to their feet the instant she walked through that cafeteria door, they knew. They would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The specific, permanent understanding that quiet competence rarely announces itself through appearance or first impression alone. That the gentlest, most unassuming person in the room is sometimes exactly the person capable of holding everyone else steady when the worst moments of their lives arrive, and that the words quiet nurse, spoken with dismissive certainty, would never again fully capture the extraordinary weight of everything Grace Ellison had actually done, and continued to do, for everyone fortunate enough to find themselves in her care. 5 years after the health fair, Grace received an invitation to speak at a national conference focused on veterans' healthcare transition, an invitation that carried a specific significance beyond the ordinary professional recognition such requests typically represented. The conference organizers had specifically requested that she speak not just about her clinical training program, but about her own personal journey, from combat nurse to civilian healthcare leader, understanding that her story carried a resonance that pure clinical methodology alone couldn't fully capture. Grace considered the invitation carefully, weighing her long-standing preference for letting her work speak for itself against the specific, growing recognition that her story had already, through informal channels, helped considerably more people than she'd ever anticipated when she first walked through that cafeteria door 5 years earlier. She discussed the decision with Aaron Voss during one of their regular calls, seeking his perspective as someone who understood both the veteran community's needs and her own particular reluctance around public visibility. "I think you should do it," Voss told her. "Not because you owe anyone your story. You don't. But because I've watched, over 5 years, how much good has come from the parts of your story you've been willing to share. I think there's more good still waiting in the parts you haven't told yet." "I worry about it becoming performance," Grace admitted. "About the story becoming more important than the actual, ongoing work." "I don't think that's a real risk for you," Voss said. "I've known you for years now, Grace. You've never once let recognition become the point of anything you do. I think you're allowed to trust that about yourself, even while stepping into a bigger stage than you're used to." Grace ultimately accepted the invitation and spent several weeks carefully preparing a presentation that wove together her clinical training methodology with a more personal account of her own journey. The combat service, the specific losses that had shaped her, the 2 years of careful civilian anonymity, and the single extraordinary morning that had forced her to finally integrate every part of who she was. The presentation, delivered to a room of several hundred healthcare professionals and veterans advocates, received a standing ovation that reminded Grace, in its own way, of that first extraordinary morning 5 years earlier, though this time, she noted with a specific, quiet satisfaction, the applause came not from people who owed her their lives directly, but from people moved by the broader truth her story represented, about resilience, dignity, and the specific danger of underestimating quiet competence. After the presentation, a young Army nurse named Captain Elena Reyes approached Grace during the conference reception, visibly nervous but determined to speak with her directly. "I'm about to separate from active duty," Reyes told her. "I've been terrified about what comes next. Everyone talks about the transition like it's simple, like you just take off the uniform and become a civilian nurse and that's the whole story. Nobody talks about what it's actually like, carrying everything you experienced into rooms full of people who have no idea what any of it actually meant." Grace recognized, immediately and completely, the specific fear Reyes was describing, having lived through nearly identical uncertainty herself years earlier. "It's not simple," she agreed. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I want you to know something that took me considerably longer to understand than I wish it had. You don't have to fully explain yourself to anyone who hasn't earned that explanation yet. You can do quiet, excellent civilian work while keeping your full history private, for as long as you need to. The right people, when the right moment comes, will eventually understand exactly who you are. You don't have to force that understanding before you're ready to offer it." "How do you know when you're ready?" Reyes asked. "Sometimes you don't get to choose the timing," Grace said, with a small, wry smile. "Sometimes circumstances choose it for you, in ways you'd never have anticipated. But I promise you this, whatever version of readiness eventually arrives, you'll have exactly what you need when it does." The competence you built in uniform doesn't disappear just because you've changed out of it. Reyes absorbed this with visible relief. The specific unburdening of someone who had been carrying an isolating uncertainty for longer than she'd fully admitted even to herself. "Thank you," she said. "I think I needed to hear that from someone who'd actually lived through it." "That's most of what conversations like this one are actually for," Grace said. "Not new information, just someone who's actually been there, confirming what you already suspected but needed someone else to say out loud." They exchanged contact information before parting, and Grace added Elena Reyes to the small but growing informal network of veterans and transitioning service members she had, over the preceding years, become a quiet but genuine resource for one more thread in the considerably larger web of impact that had grown, gradually and organically, from a single cafeteria morning she had never once anticipated would become the defining pivot point of her civilian career. 6 years after the health fair, Grace received an unexpected phone call from a documentary filmmaker who had heard, through the Veterans Outreach Network, about the specific story of her transformation from quietly mocked civilian nurse to nationally recognized trauma response educator, expressing interest in producing a short documentary focused on her journey and the broader lessons it offered about institutional culture change. Grace, true to her long-standing preference for letting her work speak louder than any personal spotlight, initially declined the request, and it took several weeks of careful consideration, alongside a specific conversation with Aaron Voss about the potential broader benefit to the veteran community, before she ultimately agreed to participate, on the condition that the documentary center the veterans' own stories as prominently as her own. "I don't want this to be about me single-handedly overcoming adversity," she told the filmmaker directly, during their first planning conversation. "I want it to be about the entire community of people this story actually touches, the veterans who trusted me with their care, the colleagues who eventually learned to see me clearly, the newer nurses I've had the privilege of training. If we can't tell that fuller story, I'm not interested in participating." The filmmaker agreed, and the resulting documentary, released the following year, wove together interviews with Grace, Ainsley, Dr. Kwan, and several of the veterans from that original health fair, presenting a considerably more complete and textured account of the institutional transformation than any single retelling had previously managed to capture. The documentary drew modest but meaningful attention within healthcare and veteran advocacy circles, generating renewed interest in Grace's training program and, more significantly to her, several additional messages from healthcare workers and veterans who found their own experiences reflected in the story. James Whitlow, interviewed for the documentary, offered what would become one of its most widely quoted moments, a brief, unscripted reflection delivered with the same quiet conviction that had characterized his gratitude toward Grace from their very first reunion. "People think heroism looks loud," he said. "Dramatic, announced. But the most heroic thing I ever witnessed was a woman who never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, and simply refused to let go of my hand for 11 hours because she'd decided, somewhere in there, that I was worth fighting for. That's what real strength actually looks like. It's quiet. It shows up, consistently, without needing an audience." The end. 5 years after the health fair, Grace received an invitation to speak at a national conference on veteran healthcare, an opportunity she approached with the same careful, deliberate thoughtfulness she brought to every significant decision, ultimately accepting on the condition that Aaron Voss and several other veterans from the original health fair be invited to join her on stage, sharing their own perspectives rather than allowing her account to stand as the sole narrative of what had happened. The panel discussion, when it took place, drew a considerably larger audience than conference organizers had initially anticipated, word having spread within veteran advocacy circles about the specific, remarkable story of institutional transformation Grace and her colleagues had built together. Voss spoke first, describing the original mission that had brought Grace into his life, the specific 11 hours she had spent refusing to let him die, and the years since during which her example had continued to shape how he thought about resilience and genuine strength. "I've met a lot of people. The public calls heroes," Voss told the assembled audience. "Most of them would tell you, if you asked honestly, that the label doesn't quite capture what actually happened in whatever moment earned them the title. I think Grace would tell you the same thing. She wasn't trying to be a hero that day or any other day. She was just refusing to give up on the people in front of her, over and over, for years, until refusing to give up simply became who she was." Grace, following him at the podium, offered her own reflection on the specific arc that had brought her to this particular stage, this particular audience, this particular moment of full, public integration between the two halves of her professional identity she had once worked so hard to keep carefully separate. "I spent 2 years believing that keeping my military service quiet was protecting me," she said. "I've come to understand, in the years since that health fair forced everything into the open, that the quiet was actually costing me something significant. The chance to build genuine, complete relationships with the people around me. The chance to let my full history inform and strengthen my civilian work, rather than existing as a separate, hidden chapter. I don't think everyone needs to make their story as public as mine eventually became. But I'd encourage anyone carrying a similar kind of careful separation to examine, honestly, whether the privacy is actually protecting them or simply keeping them smaller than they're capable of being." The panel concluded to sustained, genuine applause, and in the reception that followed, Grace found herself approached by numerous healthcare professionals and veterans alike, each carrying their own version of a story that had, in some way, been touched by the broader ripple effects of what had started as a single, remarkable morning in a hospital cafeteria 5 years earlier. She thought, driving home from the conference that evening, about how impossibly far the arc of her life had traveled since that first extraordinary morning. From a quiet, deliberately unremarkable nurse, absorbing careless cruelty without complaint, to a woman standing on a national stage, sharing hard-won wisdom with an audience of strangers who had, in their own ways, found something genuinely useful in her story. She understood, with the specific clarity that came from years of reflection, that none of it would have happened without Preston Ainsley's initial cruelty, without the specific, painful catalyst of public mockery that had, however unintentionally, forced her carefully hidden history into the open. She did not believe his cruelty had been necessary, or that it somehow justified itself through the good that eventually followed. She believed, instead, something considerably more nuanced, that even the worst moments of a difficult chapter could become, through consistent effort and genuine transformation, part of a story that ultimately helped far more people than the original wound had ever hurt. That understanding, hard-won across 5 years of continued growth and reflection, had become, for Grace, one of the most valuable lessons her entire journey had ultimately taught her. That vindication, when it finally arrived, mattered less as personal validation than as an opportunity to build something genuinely useful for everyone who came after. Every nurse who might otherwise have been dismissed. Every veteran who might otherwise have struggled alone. Every institution that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, failing to see the quiet, extraordinary competence standing directly in front of them, waiting patiently to finally be seen.